really wonderful to be here today and part of this conversation. And I will talk briefly about my experience as a student research assistant on a project that was reinstalling an African art collection in a university museum. And I think that's also fascinating that so many colleges in the US also have museums attached to them. And so I'll speak very briefly about how the collection that was being reinstalled was actually a quote-unquote gift from a private collection. And it was, I think the researcher was called Owen Mott, and he lived in Congo for several years, and then eventually relocated to the US with this huge African collection from the time he spent in Congo.
Collecting objects.
Collecting objects.
Collecting.
Some of the issues that came up with that is the provenance of these objects. Of course, in the notes that he took, it's a lot of them were bought, but some of the ethics around was it a fair trade, etc. But in this reinstallation, I guess in the scholarly setting of which the objects are being reinstalled, some of the questions that were raised are a lot of the conventions of how museums display their objects are they would name the artist, they would say where it's from, but for African objects, it's always like a blanket. This is from the Congo people, this is from the Yoruba people. So some of the intervention that was made there was then to understand that this, even in the locales in which these things were made, that there were artisans, there were artists who were making these things. So
surprise, it wasn't that all of us
all of us, and then
together.
And then we chopped a carving. So then in that case, then a lot of museums are now starting to rename their objects and recognizing that this was an unrecorded artist. When we took these things, we didn't write people's names. This is an unidentified artist. So that was one of the interventions that was made. And also a lot of times in a lot of foreign museums, something that they also do is the ways in which they curate African art is very much geographic, is very much ethnographic, is very much like anthropological, even in museums in which you think of artifacts and art objects and hold them in high regard. So in that case, thinking again about what are other ways you can curate African art in ways that they're in conversation with each other. So in this case, the thematics of the exhibition were then to think about this more broadly and think about the different functions that these objects held in the different areas they were collected from. So then it was titled Dimensions of Power, and thinking about the economic, the cultural, the spiritual, so the different ways that these objects were then used. And then, of course, the issue that's always very touchy is questions of provenance, and that's always like very lightly touched on, and how far and how open people are to really look at where these objects were found, who took them from where, but also recognizing that there was very poor documentation already. So then what is the process of revising, and actually being very intimate and very careful with how then we rethink those collections.